Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. How should we view the ethical status of the act of voting? Not is one candidate or one party better than the other one, or why is one candidate or party better than the other one, but the act itself. How do we think about the morality of our engagement with electoral systems? I've been interested in this question for a long time, both from a political philosophy point of view, what actually is right here, what moral claims make sense in this domain, but also from a political theory point of view. It seems to me that when we talk about a particular election, when we make arguments for or against a candidate or for or against abstention in a particular case, we're often explicitly or more often implicitly making moral claims about how we should regard electoral systems and our participation within them. So it was really interesting for me to sit down digitally and have a conversation with someone who just makes the opposite case, that we shouldn't vote. We in fact have an ethical obligation not to. My guest in this episode, making such a claim, is Chris Freiman. Now, we're obviously coming from really different points of view on this, but it's been a wheelhouse of both of ours for quite some time, so I found this conversation really interesting and useful, just for me, to kind of really pressure test and think through in actual dialogue all of the different threads that we do weave into the ethical claims we make about the act of voting. Sometimes really having to test your views against the complete opposite really does force you to clarify them, and I found it an interesting exercise. Chris was a very engaging conversation partner, and it's my pleasure to bring you this conversation with him. So we set up the topic and we go through it. I don't think I need to say any more in advance. I thought this was an interesting conversation to have, and I hope you do too. This is Ignoring Politics with Chris Freiman. I am joined today by Chris Freiman. Chris, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump in, what's like a quick introduction for people who don't know you? What are some of the things you like to read and write and teach and think about?
Sure. So I'm professor in the general business department at West Virginia University. So the book we'll be talking about today is Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. I'm still sort of interested in this topic, so the ethics of political participation, the ethics of voting. More generally, I'm interested in questions about distributive justice, immigration. I'm working on libertarianism. I do some democratic theory. So those are sort of the topics that have been capturing my attention recently.
Yeah, and you're... I know you kind of from Twitter. I feel like we followed each other there for a while. And you've been, if I may say so, something of a provocateur on the libertarian side, both on the tax and spending, but also on a sort of open borders libertarian type thing on both sides of that divide.
That's fair. That's right.
Okay, so let's get into today's topic. I have some questions, comments, concerns about this thesis, some of which are preempted in the book. But I want to start with I was going to say the positive case. I guess it's a negative one, why it's okay to not think about this. But as much as you can make a positive case for it, what are your opening moves for why is it okay to ignore politics? Or, yeah, go for it.
Sure. So, I mean, at the core of the argument is just this idea that, except in unusual circumstances, your political participation won't make much of a difference to political outcomes. So the case that everybody likes talking about, I like talking about, is voting. Your vote for a given presidential candidate is extraordinarily unlikely to flip the winner. Now, it might get a little complicated once we start talking about voting in swing states, and I'm happy to talk about that. But setting that case aside, your odds of flipping the election in most circumstances are very, very low. And so you say, okay, it's hard to see why you would have this positive duty to do something which won't actually make a difference. It won't make the world more just. It won't reduce any suffering. And of course, there are these arguments that, well, no, you might have this positive duty to vote or to participate in politics, because if you don't, you're going to free ride on the votes of other people, or a person who embodies civic virtue is going to be somebody who participates in politics. But at the core of this argument is just that in most cases, something like voting won't make much of a difference. And then to add on to that, the time that you spend registering to vote, researching your vote, casting your vote, and so on is all time that could be allocated elsewhere and doing things that actually do, in fact, have a positive impact. What I talk about in the book, and what I think is sort of the correct view here, is the time that you do allocate to politics should just be rerouted to something like earning to give to effective charities like the Against Malaria Foundation. So if you do that, you'll actually make the world a better place. You'll reduce suffering. Maybe people aren't fans of effective altruism and they would rather you allocate your time and effort to other causes. Again, I'd be happy to talk about that. But really, the basic argument is that in most cases, political participation doesn't do much good, and it diverts time and energy away from causes that will do good. So do the things that do good, in essence.
Would you go as far as the negative case that you have an obligation to prefer charity over, and that you should never vote? Or would you merely say, vote if you want, but don't feel like you have to, and your time might be more efficaciously spent elsewhere?
So I would actually want to go a step further and say, in ordinary circumstances, it probably is wrong to vote or to be politically active. And I say that for the sort of opportunity cost reason that I was alluding to. So just to motivate this idea, so I realize that this is a counterintuitive claim, so just to make it more intuitive, here's a thought experiment that I sometimes give. It's kind of a Peter Singer style case. But, imagine that you're at work, it's election day, and you're planning on voting soon, but the polls are going to close in a couple of hours. But that's all right, because you hop in your car, you're driving to the polls. But when you stop at a stop sign, you notice some kids playing baseball, and one of the kids gets hit in the eye with a baseball. And you walk over and you realize that this kid's sight is in danger. If he doesn't get to the hospital now, he's going to lose his sight. And so you have this moral dilemma. You can either take this kid to the hospital and save his sight, in which case you'll lose the chance to vote because by the time you're done, the polls will have closed, or you can let the kid lose his sight and go vote. Now, to me, it seems like you would be doing something wrong by letting the kid lose his sight so that you can vote. And they say, okay, like if you value saving one kid's sight above a vote, which again is not going to be consequential, then you say, all right, well, let's look at a more realistic case where somebody just says, look, I'm not going to pay attention to politics. I'm not going to bother to register to vote. I'm not going to watch the debates. I'm not going to cast a vote on election day. Well, what I'll do, that's going to save me at least a couple of hours, probably much more than that. And I'll just work a few hours of overtime in the time that I would have allocated to politics. And then I spend that money that I earn by working overtime, or I donate that money that I earn to an effective charity that saves children's sight. That's the same sort of trade-off that's involved in the first case. And so if you think it's wrong to cast an inconsequential vote at the cost of a kid's sight in the first case, you should think it's wrong to register and research and cast a vote under ordinary circumstances at the expense of a kid's sight.
So I guess there's two possible challenges that could be made to that. Feel free to go down either route. One is just the empirical claim that working a few extra hours of overtime would generate enough money that donated to a charity would at the margin save a kid's sight. You could probably mount a pretty effective empirical claim that isn't the case. I think the effective altruism rates the Malaria Net charity is the sort of most effective sort of life saved for the dollar, and even there it's something like $4,000 or $5,000 per life saved. So you'd either have to have a very high hourly wage or be working a lot of overtime. I guess the other concern people have with the, as you say, those sorts of Peter Singer type arguments, is it seems to be putting you onto a slippery slope, not just where you wouldn't vote or wouldn't do anything, but you would really then, the implication seems to be, never have any free time, never do anything other than grind out whatever your highest earning dollar amount is, and then give all of that away to whatever cause, such that you're living at essentially the sustenance level yourself. And maybe that's a correct ethical conclusion, but most people find that counterintuitive too. But those are, I think, the first two things people would think there. So feel free to take me up on either or both.
Yeah, great. I think those are both very important objections. On the first one, so we could say, the amount of good you can do by foregoing political participation and reallocating that time and energy to effective altruism or earning to give, I think it's going to depend on how much time, people think we are obligated to allocate to political participation, or how much time people actually do allocate to political participation. So I did some back of the envelope calculation at the end of my book, where I said, I forget exactly what the numbers are, but like if you're, making the standard American wage, which is like $25 an hour, and you realize you're spending about an hour a month on politics, and you say, look, I'm just going to totally forget about that. I'll work an extra hour a month. And you save that and you invest it wisely, and it grows at like 7 or 8% a year. After a few decades, it's enough money to save a dozen lives. So that, again, that's just a back of the envelope calculation, and I forget the details. And so you might say, maybe we can't save tons of people, but even if by foregoing politics for your entire life, you're still saving 1 or 2 lives, that's better than not doing that. That's better than not saving those 2 lives and spending this time researching politics, casting a vote, and so on. And even then, even if you're sort of an effective altruism skeptic, I could say, look, just spend that time, working at a soup kitchen or something like that. So effective altruists are sort of skeptical about the value of an individual's marginal contribution to a soup kitchen. But if like effective altruism is not for you, we could say, well, there are lots of alternatives which are still better than political participation. As to the second point, what I would say is I like to interpret effective altruism as a view about the quality of help that we're obliged to give rather than the quantity. So you're right, there's this worry that if we just say, look, we have to examine the opportunity cost of every single one of our actions. And every time I'm, watching a TV show, I could be earning to give to the Against Malaria Foundation. And so I have to earn to give. Then, yeah, we're talking like 1970s Peter Singer style, where you're doing nothing but working and donating. But I think there's a more moderate version of effective altruism, which is less counterintuitive. And this essentially says, let's grant that you're permitted, it's morally permissible to allocate a lot or even most of your life to self-interested concerns. So suppose it's morally permissible to spend 90% of your time on yourself, your friends, your family, and so on. Well, that still leaves this question of what should you do with the 10% of your life that ought to be devoted to helping others. And there's nothing magical about the 10% number. So we could argue about that. Maybe it's got to be 20%, maybe it should be 5%, who knows. But I'll say whatever you think that number is, that percentage, sort of your altruism budget, should be allocated to the most effective forms of help. So an analogy that I sometimes give is to just like a regular financial budget that people might have. You might say, you're not obligated, or it's not sort of rational for you to save 90% of your income for retirement. That seems too high. Maybe you should save 10%, maybe you should save 15%. But then there's this further question of, okay, you're saving 10%, 15% for retirement. How should you invest that? Should you buy lottery tickets, or should you invest in the stock market, index funds, things like that? It seems clear to me you shouldn't buy lottery tickets. You should invest all of that 10% or the 15% in wise stock investments. And so similarly, I would say you're not obligated, or maybe you're not obligated to spend 90% of your time helping other people. Maybe it's only 10%, maybe it's 15%. But that 10%, that 15% should be allocated in the way that helps people the most. So you're allowed to watch TV. That goes under the 90% that's for you. But when you're doing the 10% for other people, it would be wrong to spend that in ways that don't actually help people, which would include voting in most circumstances. And so you should do something like earn to give to the Against Malaria Foundation instead.
It does, yeah. I mean, it does occur to me as someone who's worked in the charity sector for about 10 years now, including in fundraising, that we can debate, is it this Peter Singer thing if you've got to really work yourself down to like you're only living on a very small amount. That's not the realistic choice that most people are making, whether to do that or not. Nor even would I say the realistic choice is between different forms of doing good. The choice is whether to do good at all. People will often say in response to a fundraising ask, I would prefer not to give to a humanitarian cause. I would prefer to give to a human rights cause. I think that does more good. Or I prefer to give to an animal charity or X, Y, Z. But most of the time as a charity fundraiser, even if you're doing it at quite a high level with, in a more philanthropy type setting where people are giving away large amounts, you're not really competing with other charities. You're competing with someone's savings or someone maybe having, I don't know, 2 cars instead of 1, or you know what I mean? Like the choice isn't really, are we doing 10% of our income or 20%? Very, very few people even do 10. The choice is between doing it at all. So that's a more general challenge. But is this sort of pitting one form of good against each other, as you say, to find the most efficacious? Is even that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, it might not be the right way to think about it in terms of, how people are actually making decisions or how their psychologies work, that sort of thing. But it does seem to me like, in some very important sense, competing charitable causes are in conflict with one another, just in the sense that a dollar given to a political campaign is a dollar not given to the Against Malaria Foundation, or an hour spent researching a vote is an hour not spent working overtime to donate to the Against Malaria Foundation or give directly or something like that. So what I think I would want to say, and this is maybe not a totally satisfactory answer, is something like this. My view is that the morally correct thing to do is to allocate the entirety of your, what I'm calling like quote unquote altruism budget, to the most effective forms of altruism. So an hour spent, trying to help others via the vote is actually misspent. You should be spending that earning to give to the Against Malaria Foundation or something along those lines. So like that is in fact wrong, but like just as a matter of how people are actually making decisions or what their psychologies are like, they might not think of the trade-off in those terms. They would say, well, the reason I'm not donating to the Against Malaria Foundation is, like you said, I want to buy a second car. And I would say, well, maybe we have reasons to criticize them for doing that as well. But I would just want to say the primary objection is spending that hour, that marginal hour, on a vote rather than more effective forms. And here again, to go full effective altruism here, all I would really urge you to do is do something that is more effective than voting. And there are going to be lots of options there. So, volunteering at a local homeless shelter, just earning to give and buying warm clothes for somebody who needs warm clothes. It's almost certainly going to do more good than casting a vote.
Here's one thing that occurred to me, and this is kind of a definitional worry, but that's sort of what philosophers do. And you might say that this is just semantics, but it seems to me like even with a moderately broad conception of politics, we don't have to go into this thing of where everything is political, but even with a conception that would say include who controls resources and how they're distributed, Giving to charity is a political act, often one that will impact on capital P politics. How aid money is spent will impact governments. It's often spent lobbying governments or working in collaboration for them. And then conversely, the political conditions on the ground will determine how efficacious aid is. So, isn't it more accurate, if far less pithy, to say not that it's okay to ignore politics? What you're saying is you would rather people deprioritized one form of politics, i.e., electoral politics, and prioritized other forms of politics over it.
Yeah, interesting. I would be okay with that. Like you said, it would be a longer title for the book in that case. But so yeah, so if somebody wants to have this broader conception of what politics involves, such that earning to donate to charities counts as political, then I would say, well, okay, maybe not going to put up too much of a fight about that point, as long as people are not voting and spending that time earning to give to charities. I'm happy. I'm 99% happy at that point.
Okay, so let me build off that a little. The reason I ask isn't just to quibble over definitions of the political, although that's something I've spent a large amount of time doing. It's that I do see them as connected in a fundamental sense beyond the linguistics. So in my world, which is activism, people often contrast direct action and voting. I'd rather take part in a protest than to vote. And you could, if assuming charity is political, we could add that to the mix as well. But if you look at a lot of big political changes that we have reason to think are desirable, it's actually been a sort of combination of all three, and in ways where it's not clear which was determinative and it's hard to disentangle. So one of the first things I spent time working on was gay marriage, which eventually happened. And like that had electoral inputs in terms of like politicians voted for those judges. It also had societal inputs. I would also say charitable inputs. I'd say people giving a lot more to, say, anti-AIDS causes or something like HRC, raised visibility, contributed into that. It's kind of just a mess of different inputs into that. And you might say, even within there, specialization is fine, necessary even. But the voting piece requires broad participation. I don't think we'd have been there if the political right had won more elections. It was part of the story. I kind of see it as like a lot of the stuff we might want in the world kind of comes about through this very, very causally messy process, and you kind of want to proceed on all fronts. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think I'm in agreement with a lot of that. So I certainly don't want to say that voting as a collective enterprise or protesting as a collective enterprise makes no difference, because I do think those activities make a difference. The question that interests me in this context, or one of the questions that interests me in this context, is, so what does that mean for a single individual deciding how to allocate their time and energy? So you say, look, if lots of people vote one way or the other, that clearly makes a big difference. That has an impact. But one individual's vote doesn't have an impact on whether or not that collective is efficacious. And my view then is to say, okay, given that you're sort of faced with two options: vote, and it doesn't change the outcome, or any outcome really, or you don't vote and allocate that towards something else. And it could even be something else that's related to the relevant political cause. And you say that might help individual particular people, even though it doesn't really change political institutions. That's really all that's under your control. It's sort of, do you make an inconsequential contribution to a consequential collective effort, or do you say, I can't really have an impact on the success of the collective effort, but what I can do is have an impact maybe on particular individuals? So just to take, like, running with the against malaria case, you might say, I can cast a vote for the candidate who's better on foreign aid, but that's not going to change how governments actually allocate foreign aid. But what I can do is, again, earn some money and give that money to particular people who really need it overseas. Now, this is sort of connected to an adjacent objection, which is, well, given that voting as a collective activity is efficacious and is important, what if everybody took your advice? This is kind of a common objection that I get. And
that was going to be my next question.
Okay, good. Yeah. So like my glib answer to that is, there's no danger of everybody taking my advice. I'll put it to you that way. I find that most people are not willing to buy my arguments for not voting. But sort of the less glib answer is, yeah, it would be bad, maybe, but plausibly it would be bad if everybody took my advice and stopped voting to earn money for malaria relief. But I'm also not sure that that is a morally significant problem. So let me give you another case to kind of motivate this idea. So imagine, a student, approaches you and says, well, I'm thinking about becoming a neurosurgeon. And you say, okay, well, like, are you going to be a good neurosurgeon? Are you going to study hard? Are you going to save lots of lives? She goes, yeah, I'm really going to do really well as a neurosurgeon, but I have a worry. And you're like, well, what's your worry? It sounds like you're really going to help a lot of people as a neurosurgeon. She goes, well, if everybody decided to be a neurosurgeon, we would starve because there would be no farmers and therefore we would have no food. Therefore, I'm worried it would be wrong for me to be a neurosurgeon. And that strikes me as a weird concern for this student to have about going into neurosurgery. Like, it is true that would be bad if everybody did it, but you might just say, given the background conditions of the way that the world is and is going to be, there's no danger that everybody's going to take up neurosurgery and everybody's going to stop farming. And so given that she can do more good on the margin as a neurosurgeon than a farmer, it seems like she has really strong reason to become a neurosurgeon. And so similarly, you might say, look, I can either earn to give to the Against Malaria Foundation, or I can prepare and cast a vote. And I'm worried about earning to give to the Against Malaria Foundation because if everybody did that, it would be disastrous. I could say that's true, but there's not really any worry that lots and lots of people are suddenly going to stop voting so that they can earn to give to the Against Malaria Foundation. And even if they did, even if that started happening, then it might actually be the case that you have a strong reason to vote. So to take the most extreme case, if literally everybody stopped voting, well, then you really should vote because then your individual vote would be decisive and you could determine the winner of the election. But that's not really realistic. So given the world as it is, you should figure out the way to do the most good on the margin. And that's going to be earning to give rather than voting or engaging in other forms of political participation.
So your argument is maybe in application softened a little from you have an obligation not to vote to, in the current state of the world and the current state of how people allocate their time and resources, it would be better if less people did and more people earned to donate.
That's right. And if circumstances were to change radically, then then my moral advice, my moral position might be different as well. Although in the case of something like a presidential election in the United States, I don't see it changing radically in the foreseeable future. I mean, there's this interesting question too about voting in swing states. I don't know if that's something that you want to discuss, but a number of people say, well, it's true if you live in California, your vote is inconsequential. It's not going to make a difference. But if you live in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, the odds of you actually flipping the election are not so terrible. So there may be 1 in 10 million or something like that. But a 1 in 10 million chance of flipping the election is not bad. And so it might be worth doing. I think that's an interesting argument, that if you live in one of these swing states, maybe you have good moral reason to vote.
If I'm being intellectually honest as a pro-voter, as it were, I'm happy to just write off the swing state case to the other side. I think, the example you've got maybe is like Bush v. Gore in 2000, in which case, if you knew it was going to be that close, it actually is worth your time to vote. But like that case was a genuine freak occurrence. I think, if you're on the voting side, I think as a matter of intellectual honesty, in something like a presidential election, the odds of your vote being determinative are functionally zero. It might change a bit with some local elections where like a few hundred people vote. Like that might be more of an edge case. From my point of view, I think if you're gonna mount a case for voting, it has to be on other grounds. If your case for voting is that it makes sense in some sort of expected value, the good times the probability, I think as a matter of intellectual honesty, we can say that argument's going nowhere.
Well, a further concern too is that at most it gets you to a duty to vote if you're living in one of 6 or 7 states. And my suspicion is that most defenders of voting wouldn't be satisfied with that. So I suspect that many defenders of a duty to vote think of it as a general duty. So it's similar to a duty to keep your promises. And it would be strange if you had a view about promise keeping that said you're obligated to keep your promises in Pennsylvania, but not California. But if you really go into the swing state argument, then you say, well, you have a duty to vote, maybe in Pennsylvania, but not California. And so that's a fairly small victory, even if the expected utility argument were to work. It only gets you voting in a few states.
Yeah. So I think there's another type of moral obligation we might have between, on the one hand, say a Peter Singer-ish, you have an obligation to help the child who has an eye injury, and on another side, you, I don't know, like a Kantian keep your promises type obligation. So you said the farmer case as a but I worry that if no one was a farmer, then no farming would happen. You could also make the case, I think you in your book give the case of we want murders to be solved, and it would be pretty bad if no one was working on that, but that doesn't create an obligation to be a police detective, right? I wonder, though, if, yes, there's no obligation to be a police detective, but that profession still sort of requires all of the rest of us to buy into certain social norms in order for it to, function. Not all of us have to be police detectives, but for the thing to happen, i.e. murders to be solved and murderers punished, there is a broad sort of social norm that you should, if you witness a murder, you should tell the truth about it to the police, even if that might be someone you know. That if called up to serve on a jury, you will serve on that jury. Now, of course, in the reality of the world, people shirk those obligations all the time. People lie to the police all the time. People refuse to talk to the police all the time. People try to get out of jury duty all the time. But enough. Maybe somewhere around a majority, at least a substantive minority, partake in those obligations, and it takes at least a substantial minority partaking in those social norms for the thing to work. It seems to me voting's more like that than either the child with an eye infection or the Kantian don't tell a lie.
Yeah, that's interesting. So my first thought is there's a disanalogy between that case and the voting case. So maybe so let me back up and explain. So on my view, and maybe we disagree about this, but my view is we have too many voters. So in other words, we could get the same sort of political outcome plus other good stuff like malaria relief if we had fewer people voting and more people earning to give. Now, that's not to say we want zero voters. I don't think we want zero voters, but we currently have too many voters from the perspective of efficiency or something like that. So maybe we have too much buy-in to the norm. So to make the two cases analogous, and this might be a strain, would be suppose 9 out of every 10 people decided that they wanted to become a police detective. And you might say, that's probably too many detectives. We need some more farmers. We need some more neurosurgeons. And so I start going around. I say, hey, maybe think about a new career choice. Maybe you should actually go into neurosurgery, or maybe you should become a farmer, because that's actually going to have very little impact on the quality of policing. But it does mean that people are going to get fed who otherwise wouldn't get fed. Brain surgeries will happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. So in terms of sort of actual buy-in with the norm of detective work, we might not have enough. But to render it analogous to the voting case, I think we would have to imagine that we actually have too much. We could actually make the world a better place if we had fewer detectives and more farmers. And so I would say we have too many voters and not enough effective altruists.
Well, in my analogy, the voters aren't the police detectives. The voters are people who would testify to a police detective or serve on a jury. For the police detective to do their role, they need like at least half the population to buy into those things. That's kind of what I was drawing at.
I see. So yeah, my thought about that then would be the wrong that happens if you refuse to testify is that you make it much more likely in a particular case that an injustice will be done. And so my hunch is that that's the source of the obligation to testify or to cooperate more generally with a detective's work. Whereas if
What
you
about
have
to
an
serve
individual,
on a jury, say? Like you could serve on a jury and it doesn't cause a direct harm. Someone else will just fill your place. But for the
yeah,
jury system to work, you need some significant percentage of the population to be okay with doing it. Otherwise, it would just grind to a halt.
right. That's a good case. That's a good case. So I think I would say we'd have to flesh out the details a little bit. So suppose so there's like no law that mandates voting, but there are laws about jury duty. So what if we just say, well, it's volunteer, volunteer only jury duty. Does that imply that everybody has an obligation to serve on the jury? I don't know, not to belabor the point, but if you're the neurosurgeon and you're called up for jury duty and it's optional, I would rather have that person say no and perform some more neurosurgeries. I think that's probably what they ought to do. But you're right. If too many people start opting out, then that would be a problem. We do need significant buy-in. So in the voting case, I would say, yeah, I'm with you. We do need a certain percentage of the population to buy into this practice, to democracy, to voting, and so on. But we don't need everybody to do it. And in fact, it would probably be bad if everybody did it, or at least worse than the alternative that I'm proposing, where many people buy in, but other people opt out to do other sorts of things. And then this might bring it back to the, well, what if everybody decided to opt out sort of objection? I'd say, yeah, we don't have to worry about that. I'm not that persuasive. We don't have to worry about everybody opting out. But if I got like 10 people to opt out to engage in effective altruism instead, I think that would be good.
Yeah, so I think what this is revealing is one difference we might have is what do we think is the sort of number at which this would start becoming a problem? Because I'm not necessarily arguing for a legal obligation to vote. I think it should be sort of like a positive social norm. And it seems democracies trundle along just fine with 50, 60% voter turnout. But you're, I think, imagining something significantly less than that. Here's a thought. I wonder if the number you come to, i.e., if we both had to write down on an envelope what percentage could turn out full, and we'd start to feel like this was a real problem. I'm not exactly sure what I'd put or what you would put, but I think you'd put a much lower number than me. I suspect what number you put might be to do with what you see as the function of democracy and the justification of democracy. And I think the way you're thinking about it might be much more along the lines of what are called epistemic justifications of democracy. Democracy is there to get the right answer, in a sense, which I think is part of the function of democracy. I would also add to that democracies exist to disperse power. There's a natural tendency for power to coagulate in the hands of a few individuals or one individual that can be very, very harmful when it happens. So in something like Samuel Eli Bagg in The Dispersation of Power, sort of says, democracies might not always get to the right outcome. They might never get to the right outcome. People might vote for all sorts of dumb reasons. But a universal franchise and regular elections kind of disrupt this coagulation of power. They randomize it. They force politicians to appeal, if not directly to the voters, to all sorts of intermediary interest groups and the press and so on. And it just keeps the thing from becoming an oligarchy or a tyranny. Now, if you take that latter justification of democracy, then the more participation, it doesn't have to be 100%, but the more participation you have, the better it's going to serve that function. Whereas if you take an epistemic justification, i.e., it's about getting, coming to quote unquote the right answer, you might be better with like a 5% of the population of who were real experts electorate, although that raises other concerns. Does that sort of distinction make sense?
Yeah, it does. For sort of official purposes, I want to try to remain as agnostic as possible about the justification of democracy. And sort of, I also want to say that, so there's, I want to really press hard on the distinction between sort of the universal right to vote versus the universal duty to vote. So an analogy that I sometimes give is, the right of a free press is universal. So everybody has the right to start a newspaper or a blog or something like that. And it's good that everybody has that right. But most people don't think that there's a universal duty to start a blog or a newspaper. And that's kind of how I think of voting. So there's good reason to have the universal right to vote, but that just doesn't imply the universal duty. And that doesn't quite address your question. So you could have this view that, well, democracy is not exactly about like arriving at the correct outcomes. It's like you said, it's about dispersing power and so on. That strikes me as pretty plausible. I mean, I am sympathetic to outcome-based justifications as well, but I would say there's still this further question of like, yeah, what is the percentage of people that we need to vote to actually make sure that democracy serves that function, the function of sort of dispersing power effectively? And I would guess, I don't want to put a number on it. 5% strikes me as far too low. But I would also say I don't know if we're at the point where, say, 1% less participation would really have much of an impact on its ability to perform that function. And so if we say, okay, we get the same effectiveness of democracy in terms of dispersing power, but 1% of potential voters opt out to become effective altruists, and they save 1,000 lives. I'm just making up numbers. Then it's like the sort of choice before us is equal effectiveness with 1,000 lives lost, or equal effectiveness with 1,000 lives saved. And I would say, well, clearly we want the second. We want the 1,000 lives saved. Now, at a certain point, as you say, too many people start opting out, then maybe democracy can no longer function properly. And I don't have any sort of rigorous argument to this effect right now, but my hunch is we could spare a bit of opting out and still be okay.
I think my thought there is, if we take dispersion of power as a sort of democratic justification stroke, the concentration of power seems to be, natural's a bit of a dangerous word, but a very, very strong and persistent tendency across all sorts of different societies. And I think sort of high democratic participation is one tool we have to offset that. It's not the only tool. And it's not even necessarily a sufficient tool. I think you can probably have high participation and still get concentration of power. I think one of the reasons it sort of weighs heavily on me is once you do get concentration of power, then that can threaten virtually everything else, including like truth seeking, including all of these other sort of charitable endeavors that we might want to suddenly become much less effective if you get a true tyranny. So I think from my point of view, I would say we are very imperfectly and to some degree failing to counteract the tendency of power to centralize. And if anything, we could do with not just higher, but also better political engagement. It's not just the quality, it's the quantity, and I could elaborate more on that. But I think I'd go the other way. I'd say I think we need more. But again, I don't have a strong empirical case there. It's just a hunch.
Yeah. So I mean that could be. I'm not sure what I would want to say about that. But it seems as though I could sort of take that on and still allow that, say, an individual on the margin isn't obligated to contribute to that, but they might be obligated to do certain things that alleviate the harms that come about from the concentration of power. So and I mean, this is something I think that a lot of people take issue with when they're talking to certain sorts of effective altruists, like effective altruists like me, for example, is it is very much a perspective that's focused on what's within an individual's control. And for my money, I think that is the right perspective. So to quote Jeff McMahon in one of his defenses of effective altruism, he said, "I am an individual. I'm not a collective." And that always struck me as right. So I'd say, look, like maybe it is the case that nations around the world would be better off with more democratic participation. But then the further question is, well, what value is added, or what sort of effectiveness is added by my individual participation? And it seems like it's going to be zero. Like there's actual zero additional effectiveness as a result of me adding my contribution. And you say, okay, I can have no impact on the effectiveness of democracy as an individual, but I can alleviate some suffering for particular people in the time that I would have spent on politics. So the choice again is equally effective or ineffective democracy with a life saved or a life lost. Don't say, you go for the life saved. And then we can retreat back to this question. Well, but if everybody's taking that individual's perspective, then we got a problem. But then we just go back to like how much of an influence do people actually have when they're sort of making anti-voting arguments and so on. Like if there's a real risk that by me opting out, I'm going to create this cascade of people who are no longer participating in democracy, and then this really does reduce the effectiveness in democracy in the United States, then I might sort of reel it back in. But I would say realistically, I'm just not worried that I have that much influence.
It strikes me that there's a middle ground between the sort of two viewpoints, the two, I guess you could say, decision making viewpoints, or the two long word for knowledge viewpoints that you sort of bounced between there. Of it's an individual decision, I am an individual, that's what I can control, and the level of a society, right? The level of like what's good for America is sort of like, and I guess at the end of the day, there is a sort of fundamental divide. There's a fundamental distinction to be made on to what extent do we see moral responsibility as individual or potentially collective, which we won't get time to hash that one out here. But it's always seemed to me that the arguments that we use, never mind what's ultimately right, the arguments that we use when we talk about whether or not we should vote very much often occur at the level of the group. That might be a demographic group. How should disabled people or gay people vote in this election? It might be an ideological group. How should socialists or how should libertarians vote in this election? So if you were to take, I bet you we've both had this same discussion, actually. You're in the libertarian camp, I'm more in the sort of socialisty one, where we talk about third-party voting or absenteeism. There'll be kind of this discussion of like, what should our fringe is maybe a bit disrespectful, but probably numerically not a majority group.
I'm happy to call libertarians fringe. As a libertarian, I'll take that label.
I'll take it for socialists. But how should our fringe? Because on the one hand, you can say, well, we should vote for a third party or sit it out because there's no one who neither of the main ones perfectly align with me. But then you can say, well, if everybody did that, then that could be bad. But if everybody thought the way we did, then there wouldn't be a problem because either the Libertarian or the Socialist Party would win in a supermajority every time. If everyone thought the way we did, it would be fine. But it occurs to me that the actual discussion we're having is how should libertarians or how should socialists as a collective, how should we think about this particular act in moral and political terms? That's what we're discussing. It's almost like we got four people sitting around a table and we're saying, okay, what are we going to do here? And then you map that four people up to like 4 million or something. Like that's more the conversation. It's neither at the level of a full society or just the level of me in my bedroom. It's at the level of how should we, as this intermediate group that has its own language and morality and discourse, how should we think about it? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's right. I mean, so, during election season, I see a bunch of libertarians talking about like, here's why we should vote as libertarians and who we should vote for and so on. And so I think exactly right that's an important conversation. That's one that a lot of people, like I said, on the sort of the political margins maybe do have. Yeah. So I mean, so like I was saying earlier, voting as a collective exercise, I think is consequential in a way that individual voting is not. And my view on this, I mean, this might not be what you were going for here, but my view is that, you know, groups like libertarians or socialists, if the question is, well, how should we vote collectively? Forget the individual question for now. Like, just imagine that we can sort of vote in a unified way. How should we do it? My view has always been, I mean, I actually don't know how much weight I want to put on the answer I'm about to give you, but my intuition has always been vote for the lesser evil of the major two parties. So of the two major party candidates, the one that aligns most closely with your values, knowing that of the two is going to be anything close to what you regard as the ideal. And my thought there is just, you know, a third party in the United States is just not going to win. And it's better to have less evil in the world than more evil. And so if I can instruct libertarians to vote for the lesser evil, I would do it. Now, people object on the grounds. This is kind of a rhetorical point that they make, which is, well, you keep voting for evil, you know, or the lesser evil, you're still voting for evil, and we're going to make major reforms in the parties if you keep. I mean, maybe, but I would say, I don't know, like in most elections, my view would be if I could press a button and get all libertarians to vote in a particular way, I would just say for the lesser evil of the two-party candidates, because that might actually have an impact on the outcome of the election. Whereas even if every libertarian voted for the Libertarian Party, that might bump them up from like 0.5% to 1.5%. I don't even know, but it's not actually going to affect anything. It's not going to actually make the world any different. I don't know. What do you? I'm sort of curious. What do you think?
No, I'm in that boat too. I think. Yeah, I think so. People will often say we need to build a substantive third party. My view would be, for socialists at least, sort of maintaining and expanding a presence within the Democratic Party it's a hard path, but it is a less hard path than trying to run. And we've just shown time and time again when we try the third party thing that we fail at it. Now, don't get me wrong, doing something like AOC and taking down an incumbent Dem, that's still quite a hard thing to do, but it at least happens, you know? I also just have a general, for reasons we need to go into, skepticism of the type of people who put themselves forward as independent or Green Party or so on. It might be different if these were much more serious people than they in fact are. But one thing I'll call attention to, though, with that analysis is both of us have made a morally consequentialist case at the level of the group, right? At the level of, you know, these 2 to 3 million people. And I don't know, that seems to me like actually the right level to think about it, and the level that a lot of the time people actually are thinking about it. A lot of people, when you do door-to-door political canvassing, will sort of reference their group membership. It might be a demographic group. They might say, well, as a black man or something like that. They might mention an ideological group. They might mention just a geographic group. But that, I don't think that's necessarily wrong to either think of group belief or group interest in that way. That kind of, I think, is assumed in the logic of democracy that people actually do think about it that way.
Okay, good. There's just a lot of evidence coming out now about people their sort of sense of their social identity just really impacts how they vote, who they vote for, and so on, and that is in a lot of cases the most important factor. Right, there's like this idea that oh shoot, I forget the slogan now. But it's you sort of vote who you are rather than the policies you want. And like you said, that could be a party affiliation, it could be a social affiliation, demographic, whatever. And I'll say too, just it was kind of funny when you're like, I've got some reservations about the sort of people who are in the Socialist Party. I mean, I'm in the same boat with you in the Libertarian Party. Like, I like thing about if we had an idealized libertarian party that I actually endorsed, I still would probably say libertarians should vote for the lesser evil major party candidate. But give the American Libertarian Party, the less you know about it, the better, because it's just it's a complete disaster. And so I wouldn't vote for them under any circumstances right now.
Yeah. Final question. There's two sides to this question. There's an empirical claim and then a normative implication. Does our conversation change and the moral weight we put on voting change if we are in an existential circumstance? So there's a book I've just interviewed on politicizing political liberalism by Nuti and Badano, and they argue that they're coming from a Rawlsian perspective that I'm not, but they argue to the effect that liberal democracy isn't just sort of one good amongst many or one view amongst many. It is the framework in which everything else is discussed. And if that itself is on the line, if there is a risk of the system being taken over by people who want to dismantle it and turn it into an authoritarian one, then an entirely different set of moral obligations come online, because to their eyes, and I think I sort of agree, although I wouldn't use the same logic, because this is the framework in which everything else happens. You have to at least try. When if there is looking like there might be an authoritarian takeover of the system, then you do have a duty to try and persuade people not to vote for that. You do have a duty, whereas before I think it would be at the very least a much softer duty to show up and vote against it. Now, there's two sides to that question. One is, say, in the contemporary United States, do we think we are living under such a moment? They would say that we are. I would agree, actually. I think when you look at some of the rhetoric coming from the Trump movement, we have an obligation to at least grant the possibility that they are being serious about what they say they plan to do. But then the normative side is just hypothetically saying we're in such a moment. Would that then create a different set of obligations in terms of our political actions?
And I would say, I do agree with you. I mean, things are looking very bad in the U.S. right now, and I think these are unusually bad political circumstances with the Trump administration. So what does this mean for our normative obligations? I would say a couple of things. So I would still say the question of an individual's effectiveness matters. So, for example, just to take sort of a silly kind of science fictional, if there's an asteroid coming to hit Earth, that is disastrous, and some people might be in a position to help stop that, but I'm probably not in a position to help stop that. And so, if there's nothing that I can do to stop the asteroid, it's not clear what I should be doing in that case. Plausibly, what I should be doing is making sure that I can help particular people who might be harmed by the asteroid, for example. So one thing I'm sort of inclined to say is, if again you're like a California voter, and that nothing you do is actually going to change the outcome of the election, you might say, okay, I'm still not obligated to try to change the outcome because I just can't do that. However, maybe what I should do is reallocate my efforts that I would have spent on some sort of form of direct political participation, to like maybe helping like particular immigrants that I think are to be threatened by the Trump administration. So I can't stop the asteroid, but I can do some things to mitigate the damage of the asteroid. Now, I think it is, so to return to the swing state case, one of the reasons I think it's a little bit to say, even in swing, the strong duty to vote, is it in a lot of cases hard to know who the better candidate is. But I think when you're talking about like current circumstances where like it just like I think we have overwhelming evidence that Trump was the worst candidate, you say then if you got 10 million chance or whatever the case may be of flipping the outcome for the better, then like again, like to run with the silly analogy, if I can buy a lottery ticket and somehow that if I win the lottery I can destroy the asteroid or whatever, that might be a lottery ticket worth buying. And so if you're in a swing state, and it really is very clear that one candidate is much, much better than the other, one candidate is much, much better than the other, it's worth actually taking the chance and casting a vote in those cases. So I'm not sure if it changes my analysis for non-swing states, but for swing states, I think, yeah, in those cases, maybe you do have a duty to vote. And it's kind of, I remember actually when I first started talking about this topic, it was a while back, and it was Trump Biden. I remember, well, like, live in a swing state, you should vote for Biden.
Yeah, I think that argument all tracks. I think for me, it's not so much an asteroid. It's almost like a relative with a terminal illness, and there's a low survival rate. It just sort of feels like in that situation you want to fight like hell for whatever chance of survival there is, even if that's not that much under your control, and like you say, mitigate harm for the rest of the time. But you want to be able to say that you did what you could, whatever that turns out to be. That might be a slightly irrational sense of obligation, but I don't think a bad one, and that kind of is how I feel in the current moment.
Yeah, no, I like that analogy. Yeah, and I definitely feel the force of it. But right, to run with that analogy, you could say, well, here again, there's always this opportunity cost whenever you're making a choice. And so, if the doctor really says, there's, a 1 in 150 million chance you can actually cure this disease, but if, you spend the time that you would have spent looking for a cure, looking for doctors or something like that, like comforting and making the time much better, it strikes me as rational to say, all right, given just how insurmountable the odds are, I'm going to try to mitigate the harm to that particular person. But like I said, I definitely feel the force of what you're saying.
I think that's a good place to end. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. Just finally, is there anywhere you'd like to direct listeners to go to follow your work? Website, Twitter, Blue Sky, anything like that?
Sure, they could follow me on Twitter at CA Freiman, my last name. And I also have a Substack that I occasionally use. It's just Freiman, my last name, .substack.com. And like my academic stuff is also posted online as well.
Cool. Thanks for your time, Chris. I really appreciate it.